So now we go deeper into the actual theory of writing functions in Matlab. As I said before, the most important part is that you always follow the correct structure of a function, whether it's a function file or whether the function is within your script. We have to remember that function consists of definition line, so that's how it starts. Then it has the body, so that's where we define what actually is happening in the function. And then there may be the need to add the end command depending on how the function is arranged in your work. So let's start from definition line. The major roles of definition line is that, first of all, it defines that here is where the function is starting. Second one, it defines what's the name of your function. So later when you try to call it in another file or in the same script, you will have to be using that name that you actually gave to the function in the function definition line. And finally, it defines the number and order of input and output arguments. So in more detail, if we want to write a function, first we have to start with the function word. So this is a command in Matlab which tells it you're actually going to create a function. Then you list the output arguments. So there is the assignment operator here, and you can now associate, for instance, when we used to write x equals 5. So we were assigning this value into variable x. Now here it again defines into which variables our calculations will go. So whatever happens on the right hand side is kind of the source of the values. In here we had a fixed value 5. In here we will have something that is actually producing the results, and then those results go into these x, y, z in this example, which are called output arguments. Then after the assignment operator, we have two things. We have the function name, and then we have input arguments. So every function may be different, and every function may have varying number of output and input arguments. It really depends on what that function is really supposed to do. Also notice that output arguments are grouped with squared parentheses, and the input arguments are actually given in round brackets. And that may give you some association with the built-in functions that you've used in Matlab already. For instance, when you say mean value of something, it's mean, and then in round brackets you give your vector or matrix from which you want to calculate the mean. Sometimes you would have more arguments, so they would be separated with a comma, and then there would be the function name. Again, for instance, mean, you give your input and then you say over which dimension you want to calculate the mean. So in here, the story is the same, that these round brackets tell Matlab that these items in here will be needed in performing the tasks which the function is doing. So that's why they are called input arguments. And then these ones, this is just a list of outputs, so that's why they are collected in this kind of array. So this is this whole piece in here. This is the function definition line. And whenever you create functions as part of your script or as separate file, you should follow this rule. Matlab probably differs somehow from some other programming languages. For instance, nowhere in the functions would you find as such command return, because this is what tells kind of what Matlab really returns. So the values will be assigned to output arguments, and that automatically means that these ones will be given as output, so they will be returned as values. So there is no need to kind of explicitly put in a command which says returns. And here are a few more must do or must follow rules when you write functions. So first of all, the word function or the command function, once again, which defines the fact that you're creating a function must be the very first word where your function starts, especially if you write function in a separate file. This has to be the first executable thing in your file. You could have still maybe some comment line above it, but if this is the first executable, so with no comment mark, then this has to be function. And it has to be always written like this, all letters in lowercase. Remember, Matlab is case sensitive, so if you write it with capital F, for instance, it will not recognize it as function command. Secondly, the function name. If you create your function as a separate file, this function name has to be the same as the name of the file that you create. So this will become much more natural when we start coding example functions in Matlab. Next, the rules for naming functions are same as for naming variables or script files. So once again, your function name has to start with a letter. It can only contain letters, numbers, and the underscore operator, and it is case specific, or case sensitive, which means that if you name something with lower or uppercase, then this is the only way that Matlab will recognize it with that name. And that's why, for instance, in Matlab, when you try to call also built-in functions like sum, if you type sum like this, Matlab wouldn't recognize that you actually ask for a sum function. And another key thing is that the order of input and output arguments really matters. So when you call your function, you really should know what you put in where, in the same way that they exist in the function definition line. And as I said, different functions can have different numbers of input and output arguments. So here are just a few examples of definition lines where those numbers are different. For instance, this could be definition line for a function which calculates something related with a loan, and so we give in the input arguments is the amount of the loan we take, the interest rate that the bank puts on the loan, and then the number of years we intend to pay the loan back. And then the function would calculate maybe what is the monthly payment for us, and then how long it would actually take, or what would be maybe the time instances of the payments. So there are 2 output arguments and 3 inputs. Another one, we have 1 output, 2 inputs, so that would be a function calculating area of a rectangle. So of course, to calculate that area, we need both sides of the rectangle, its lengths. Here are a and b, and as the resulting a times b would be defining what is this capital A. When we have 1 output argument, you can actually skip those square brackets which are in here. So you see the second definition line does exactly the same definition as the previous one. It's okay to skip them when you have no outputs. Then we have a function with 2 outputs and just 1 input. So for instance, we want to write a function which will calculate both the volume and the area of a sphere. So all you need for that calculation is just the radius of the sphere, and then based on the formulas given inside, we would get as output the volume and the area. You can also have functions with no outputs. So for instance, maybe a function just draws a figure, but you're not interested in any numerical values coming out. And alternatively, you could also have a function which has maybe some outputs, maybe x, y, but it has no inputs. So it could be that everything that is supposed to happen is anyway defined within the function, so you have kind of no influence on anything to change in there. So these are the examples of how the definition line could look, and of course these are just very few of millions of cases that we could come across, but at least it gives you the general idea. And what comes after function definition line is the body. The body would normally look like any other script file with just one major difference, that in the body we normally don't define values of variables. Whatever values are needed to perform our function task would be given as input arguments. That's the idea, that function works kind of like a formula, like a mathematical equation, which we could then use to calculate with different values of our, for instance, parameters or variables in that equation. So the function just gives like a scheme for how to calculate something, but doesn't have any predefined values. Only the input arguments will define for which values we are calculating that thing. Anything else in the body, what you use, do you use just simple math? Are you using loops, while or for, if-else statements, and so on? You can have anything inside body of the function. So in the next video, we will get hands-on when it comes to actually writing and calling user-defined functions.